Welcome to the Clyde Cruising Club's presentation, Taming the Tides. This presentation is aimed for newer sailors or those less experienced, with a view to encouraging people to cruise beyond the Clyde, if that's where they're based, and head a little bit further west and enjoy some of Scotland's fantastic west coast scenery safely. We'll be relying extensively in this presentation on the Clyde Cruising Club's sailing directions, and also introducing Antares charts and describing how they can be used. This is what we want to avoid in having a trip to the west coast. We want to avoid places where there would be uncomfortable conditions, perhaps even a risk to our safety. This particular picture is taken at the Doris Moor, and it's an example of wind over tide on a not particularly windy day, where wind against tide can cause severe turbulence. We're going to look at two routes to getting from the Clyde, the Greater Clyde area, to the west coast. Firstly, through the Crinan Canal, and that takes us through the tidal gates of the Doris Moor and the Sound of Lyng. And the second route round the Mull of Kintyre, which also takes us through the Sound of Lyng, but we'll have covered that by then. Here's an overview of the route to the west coast taking the Mull of Kintyre. It's about 135 miles, and if you can see my cursor, we would start somewhere in this area here in the upper Firth of Clyde area, perhaps from one of the marinas or from a mooring in this area here. Of course, you could start at Bute or Largs or a Drossen or a Troon or anywhere in this area. So wherever you might start, you would join this route and sail south. We've assumed that you might go in and take a break at Lamb Lash, and then you would sail on past the south end of Arran, round past Sander Island, round the Mull of Kintyre, start heading north through into the Sound of Jura, perhaps calling here at Craig House, that's up to you, but heading north up the Sound of Jura until you come to the Sound of Lyng, further up here, and then eventually ending up perhaps at Oban, just taking that as a typical stopping point. So this 135 miles is about 25 to 30 hours sailing, depending on the wind and wind direction, currents and so on, and it might take you 2 to 3 days depending on what your schedule is. You could of course set out and sail 135 miles and do it in just over a single day, a day and a bit, if you don't stop, but that's hardly cruising, that's more like racing. The Crinan Canal, by contrast, is about 70 miles for the same sort of start and end point, starting here in the Upper Clyde perhaps, and sailing maybe through the Kyles of Bute, down round Ardlamont Point on the south end of the Cowell Peninsula, head north towards Adrishig, and then enter the Crinan Canal through this part of the Kintyre Peninsula, come out at Crinan, head north past Corryvreckan and the island of Scarborough, Sound of Lyng, and then head on north towards Oban. It's about 70 miles. It would take about 14 hours sailing, plus about a day for the canal. So about 14 hours of sailing in total, and you might split that as perhaps 7 to 10 hours to get to Adrishig. So the first day is a day's sailing, a day through the canal, and then a bit less than a day or a shorter day from Crinan to Oban. We'll be looking at tidal gates on the way, and if you take the Crinan Canal, there's 2 tidal gates that you need to consider to get through. By a tidal gate, we mean a place where if you sail towards it and find an adverse tide, the tide's against you, unless you're in a very fast boat, it's unlikely that you'll be able to sail against it. These tides can run 5, 6, 7 knots, and if your boat is only doing that sort of speed across the water, then your only options are to sail at slack water or with the tide in the same direction as you're travelling. The 2 for the Crinan Canal are the Sound of Lyng and the Doris Moor. Doris Moor is just a small little short area. The Sound of Lyng is a little bit further to travel through the adverse tide. The Crinan Canal is known as the most scenic shortcut on the west coast of Scotland. it's a great place to go. And if you've never been, this is well recommended. Don't be too concerned about how to operate the locks. There's plenty of help available. There's directions. You have to pay to go through the canal, but included in that is a skipper's guide that shows you how to operate the locks that you need to do yourself. But you start off at either end with the lock keepers helping you with the sea locks, and you get the idea of how this works at those points. It's about a 70-mile shortcut to take this route. It's an all-weather route in that unless the most severe storms, then the part of the trip through the canal is quite adequately sheltered that you can take it in almost all weather. So if you had one day of reasonable weather to get to Adrishik heading north, and then a rather windy day through the canal, and then another nice day on the other end, that might be suitable. It's very scenic. Things you need to take with you to go through the canal are some ropes, in addition to those that you might have normally rigged on your boat. You might, of course, de-rig some of your rigging, perhaps Genoa sheets or something like that, but the best scheme is to have a few spare ropes on your boat anyway, and these might be the ropes that you use in a marina or elsewhere. But they need to be about 12 to 15 meters long. You need some fenders, and then you need some more fenders. And you can see here 3 boats locking through the locks together. So you've got not only the possibility of abrasion on your hull on the side of the lock, so you need some fenders there, but you've got other boats surrounding you. And the boats don't sit in the water just as placid as they are there. When you're going up the way in a lock, then the water can be quite turbulent as the water fills the lock. Conversely, going down the way, when you're locking down from a higher elevation to a lower elevation, it's very pleasant and very calm, and the fenders are almost hardly necessary. You'll need some crew. This is not a single-handed operation going through the lock. You probably could do it, but it would take you a long time, and you might be holding up other people. A minimum of 2, one to steer the boat and one to take the ropes, but 3 is ideal. One person steering the boat, controlling, one person on the deck of the boat handling ropes and throwing them up to the third person who's ashore, taking those ropes and securing them to the bollards on the side. If you've got more delicate hands, this amount of rope handling can require the wearing of some gloves. So a pair of gloves is a good idea. And the other thing you require is some patience. Don't expect that you can get through the canal at a great pace of knots. It's just not that way designed. There is a speed limit of 4 or 5 knots anyway, so you're not going very fast, even in the open stretches of water between the locks. And there can be delays. There can be people coming the other direction. There can be the fact that certain bridges cannot be opened simultaneously, and so you might have to wait. There's also the fact that certain bridges and locks are operated by the lock keepers, and they need to go for their meal breaks and so on. So some patience is required to account for the fact that this is a slow, leisurely journey. And if this is your first time through there, then you'll find that it's so scenic that you want to take the time anyway. It's an experience. It's a fantastic journey. This picture not only shows one of the boats that happened to be going through when I was going one day, but also this is looking through one of the lock gates. So you can see that the side that we're standing on, taking the picture, the water level is high. Here I am indicating with my cursor the water on this side of the gate is high level, and perhaps 2 meters below that, the water in the other side where this boat is much lower. This shaft here and this mechanism above it is what's known as the sluice on the gate. So this is the gate. There are 2 gates to each end of the lock, and in each gate is a sluice. This is like a little window with a shutter that can be raised and lowered. So this part goes up and down to open a hole in the bottom of the gate. And by opening that hole, the water in this top side will flow into the bottom side. By that time, the other gates down here should be closed, in which case what you do is you equalize the water level on both sides. So by opening this sluice, this water goes into that part of the lock and fills the lock up until the wet mark here. You can see the tide mark here where the height of the water has been on the previous locking. Once that's full, you can then open these gates and proceed in this direction, the direction the boat is pointing. So here we are standing on a boat, heading in that direction and filling the lock. So this is the up canal side of the lock with the gates shut and the water flowing into this lock, filling it, and it'll fill right up to this level here. And by the time we are raised those couple of meters, and every lock takes us up another couple of meters or so, then we're proceeding up over the whole of the Kintyre Peninsula. Between locks there are stretches of various lengths, some of them just short, but some of them several miles, where you can enjoy just a beautiful scenery. It's also the case that this is an amazing thing for tourists to have a look at, and you can see a couple of people here standing to watch what's going on and taking pictures. So don't be too surprised if people are taking pictures of you locking through the canal. Eventually, through the Crinan Canal, you'll come out at this end, the north end of the Crinan Canal, and this is the Crinan Hotel, and the exit from the canal is right here. You can see this lighthouse, and the entrance to the canal is just to the right of this little red and white lighthouse. There's a pier further over here that some fishing boats stop on, and there's reasonable anchorage in any of this area out here if you're waiting for entry into the canal. This hotel is a great hotel with 2 restaurants and a couple of bars worth stopping there to have a look. And round in this basin where the canal is, there's a coffee bar and a few other places that are worth stopping at. There's a boatyard just here to our right, just out of the picture, and if you're looking for any repairs or parts or something like that or some assistance, then they may well be able to help. They also sell diesel. So this is the north end of the canal, and once you're through the canal, then you would be heading north. One thing to do about planning a trip to the west is to do some passage planning, and you can do this anytime long before you set out. As long as you have some tide tables available, then you can figure out the tidal gates that you have to go through, work out what window of opportunity or window of time that you have to get through in the direction that you want to take, and therefore you can plan around those tidal gates what time you need to set out from different places. So what time should you set out from the Crinan Canal, for example, to get to the to the Doris Moor? What time should you set out from wherever you leave, perhaps Campbelltown or perhaps Arran? What time should you leave for the Mull of Kintyre? In thinking about that, you can consider the whole of Sander Sound and the Mull of Kintyre as one tidal gate. It's one area where the tide could be with you or against you, and so you need to plan for that. Okay, so we've come through the canal by now, and we've enjoyed the scenery and perhaps stopped at the hotel and enjoyed their hospitality. And we might take this track here. This is just a suggested track that you would come out of the canal and head in this direction here. And our first tidal gate that we have to get through is the Doris Moor. And so we need to get through this short little bit of water here that flows at about 5 or 6 knots, variable with the tide. On this side of it, no problem, and on this side of it. But just for this quarter of a mile or so through this gap between these islands here, then we need to plan to have the tide with us. Here's where the Clyde Cruising Club sailing directions can be useful. We want to avoid this sort of water, and so here's a page out of the sailing directions for the Kintyre to Ardnamurchan edition of the sailing directions. The sailing directions are set out in various books covering different areas. So one covers the Clyde area, for example, and has everything to do with the Greater Firth of Clyde, and a bit further south down into the Solway Firth and across to Northern Ireland, and stops at the Mull of Kintyre. The next book, Clyde to Ardnamurchan, takes over, Kintyre to Ardnamurchan, takes over at the Mull of Kintyre and covers all of those things from there to Ardnamurchan Peninsula just north of Tobermory. On page 76 of the Kintyre to Ardnamurchan version, it tells us about the Doris Moor, and that's what we just looked at in that drawing. And you can see that that's this area here, the Doris Moor, and you can see on this chartlet that there's turbulence shown in this area here. So we want to make our passage through here. The sailing directions tell us which chart we might want to use: Admiralty charts, Admiralty leisure charts, IMRE charts, or an ordnance survey. Of course, an ordnance survey is really only good for the land, not for the water. And what page in Cruising Scotland, the accompanying volume that tells you about the scenery and some of the facilities on these various places en route. Once we're through the Doris Moor, we'll get to the Sound of Lyng. And the sailing directions tell us this about the Sound of Lyng, and we can use this as our example of how to get through a tidal gate. Notice that the text says both the flood and the ebb reach 5 knots on springs and 4 knots on neaps. So you can imagine that if your boat averages, say, 5 knots sailing, and you try to sail against the current on neap tides, so you've got a 4 knot adverse current and you've got a 5 knot speed in the water, your speed made good will be 1 knot. It'll be very slow progress. Had you hit the the area at Springs when it's a 5 knot tide, then in your 5 knot boat it won't be possible to sail against it. It also says that they attain their fastest rate within the 2 hours of their run. So from slack tide for the next 2 hours or so is the fastest rate, and then it tapers off after that. It tells us which direction the tide goes. So the flood tide runs from east to west, and the ebb tide from west to east. So the north or west going stream begins at plus 330 Oban. What this means is that if you take the high tide at Oban and add 3 hours 30, you get the time that the north going or west going stream begins. So Oban plus 3 hours 30, 3.5 hours after Oban high tide is when that north going stream begins. The south going stream begins at 2 hours 15 before high tide in Oban. And it also gives you, for reference, in case you use a Dover tidal timetable, what the Dover equivalents are. This is the same time. So 3 hours 30 after Oban is the same as 1 hour 50 before Dover. It also tells us a little bit more information that these times can be advanced considerably by prolonged strong westerly winds. So if you're heading north and there has been a lot of westerly wind, strong westerly wind for the few days beforehand, then you could expect that these times might be prolonged a bit. And it gives us further information. So the sailing directions are worth reading while you're doing the passage planning. And you do this perhaps even during the winter before you even leave home. So using the sailing directions information, we can see that we can head away at Oban high tide for the day that we looked is at 4:33, and then the later high tide is at 16:49 UTC. Be careful with UTC and British summertime. Be careful to know that what the tide table you're looking at is stated in. Some of them adjust automatically for British summertime. Some of them are in UTC all the time. You're only going to be an hour out, but that hour might make the difference. So check any difference between UTC and local time. We're on BST during the summer normally, so you use these UTC times or Greenwich Mean Time, same thing. Use these times plus 1 hour. But we'll just work on UTC for the moment. So the north and west going stream starts, we said before, at 3 hours 30 on Oban, and we've just said that Oban is 04:33 in the morning. So add 3 hours 30 to 4:33, and we get 7:33. We actually, that's a mistake, we get 8 o'clock. Did you pick my deliberate error here? So 4:33 plus 3 hours 30 gives us 7 hours plus 30 minutes, and 33 minutes is another hour. So that gives us 8 hours. So it's 8 hours and 3 minutes. So 3 minutes past 8, near enough, call it 8 o'clock. South and east going stream starts at high water Oban at -215 from Oban. So the later time would be 16:49. Take off the 2 hours 15 and we'll get, excuse me, 14 hours 24. Call that 2:30. So between a few minutes after 8 o'clock and 2:30 is the window of opportunity that we have while the north and west going stream carries us further north. It starts at 8 o'clock and it finishes at 2:30, and the opposite stream starts. So our favorable tide is from 8 o'clock, remember that was an error, and 2:30, which on this particular day would be very convenient. We can come out of the Crinan Canal after breakfast and head leisurely in the morning, heading north, and that northbound stream will take us all the way to Oban. It's about 11 miles from Crinan to Ling. So we've come out of here, and the tidal gate timing for the Doris Moor is very similar to that for Ling. So if we go through here at the earliest opportunity, perhaps 9 o'clock or so, an hour after it started running in the direction we want to go through there, we'll have the tide with us. And while the tide here isn't a tidal gate, it's not doing 5 or 6 knots, it's certainly doing 1 or 2. And if our boat speed is 5 knots, then we might be making 7 knots. So you'll find this quite exhilarating, sailing, heading up here, doing a couple of knots more than you would normally do. Until you get to here, and the tidal rate through here can be 4, 5 or 6 knots. And so if you're doing 5 knots, you might end up sailing through the Sound of Ling at 11 knots. Let's have a closer look at the Sound of Ling. And we can see that it's a messy looking area. We're heading right through the middle of this lot here, and we can go either side of this island. We can go through this gap here between Fladder Island and the next little bit over to the right here, Duskier, or we can go to the left of Fladder Island between there and this disused quarry area. So we can go through here. You can see that there's 12 or 13 meters of water there, and there's 11 or 12 meters in here. And you can see that there's various places that are quite shallow, 7, 8, 9 meters, and places that are deep, 20, 30 meters. So with such an undulating bottom, you can expect that there's a certain amount of turbulence here just with the flow. And so there's lots of eddies and swirls going through here. And so a good lookout is required heading through here, even though you're going with the tide. Notice here that it says that it can do 7.5 knots. According to that chart, it can do 7.5 knots of tide through here. So it's going to be a fast boat that might sail against that. It's not to say you can't, and people do occasionally. Some racing boats can sail through there, but their speed over the ground is going to be reduced to 2 or 3 knots. The sailing directions tell us about this Sound of Ling: 5 miles long, 1 mile wide, the direct route from the Sound of Jura to the Firth of Lorne, and it takes a share of the tidal flow between these bodies of water. And here's the information that we looked at before, and it tells us how long slack water is. Note that slack water is only a quarter of an hour at Springs, but it's an hour at Neeps. So you've got a bit more of a time when there's no flow at Neeps than you have at Springs. So at Springs, the water almost comes to a stop and then just starts flowing again in the other direction. Sound of Ling, north going stream, Oban plus 345, south going stream, high water Oban minus 215. Very similar numbers, almost identical to what we had for the Doris Moor. So 8:18 and 14:24, the same time there. So our window for the Sound of Ling is almost the same window as it is for the Doris Moor. And the fact that you're going to be going with the tide means that the 11 miles between them is going to disappear very quickly. So that 11 miles might only take you an hour. And if that only takes you an hour and you set out at 9 o'clock, you're going to get there well before 2:30, the closing of the time on that date. Here's a slight digression to talk about amphidromes. An amphidromic point sometimes called a tidal node, is a geographic location, a place on the chart, which has 0 tidal amplitude for one harmonic constituent of the tide. What that means is that the tide doesn't go up and down at all as the tide changes. The tidal range, the peak to peak amplitude, in other words, the difference between high tide and low tide, gets close to 0. And you might have noticed that if you go and anchor at somewhere like Gia, there's about ½ a metre of tide. Same at Port Ellen on the island of Islay, about ½ a metre of tide. In Rathlin Island, not much tide there. Conversely, if you go somewhere else, you can find 5 or 6 metres of tide. So how is it that we can have a tide that has a tidal range of ½ a metre or less in some places, and in other places 5 or 6 metres? Doesn't that create a slope in the water? And the answer is yes, it does. But it's such a long slope that you hardly notice it, although it creates some tidal flow. So this point, and there are points all around the world, here's a map of some of them. There are these points where the tide doesn't change in height. Between high tide and low tide, almost 0 change in height. And there are points where there is a huge change. So the blue areas here is an amphidromic point, and down in the South Pacific, just there's almost no tidal range. Conversely, up here south of Alaska, huge tidal range. And notice in the North and Northwest Passage area over here, huge tidal range. But where we're interested in here, Western Europe, fairly large tidal ranges. So the tidal range in this area here is fairly large. Coming a bit closer to the UK, here are some of the amphidromic points. There's one off the coast of Denmark here. There's another one here off the coast of Norway. And what's not so evident is that there's one in the North Channel. And this is the reason that I wanted to talk about this. Here we have a chart of the west coast of Scotland, the southern part of the west coast. Here's the Mull of Kintyre, here's the island of Arran, here's Islay and Jura and so on. And this is the route that we said we might take through the Crinan Canal this direction, or perhaps from the Clyde down around the Mull of Kintyre and up here. And so we're going to go through this area here known as the North Channel. And right here, just north of the island of Rathlin of Northern Ireland, is an amphidromic point. Now the interesting thing about this point here is that, as with other amphidromic points, the time of the high tide rotates in a circle around the amphidromic point. So when it's high tide at Rathlin, it's low tide at Islay. When it's low tide at Islay, it's high tide at Rathlin. Now, if there was a huge tidal range, then there would be a steep gradient in the surface of the sea, and you would see it. There would be a slope, and that's nonsense. Water doesn't like being at a gradient. It likes to even out into a flat, apparently flat surface on the surface of the world. So there's not much tidal range in all of this area here. The tide doesn't come in, rise much, and it doesn't fall much. Now that's not to say that it doesn't flow much. There's plenty of flow, there's just not much range of height. And the further away from an amphidromic point you get, the greater the range of tide. So if you go way up here towards Oban, there's plenty of tide, perhaps 3 meters or so. So remember that when it's high tide at one side of the amphidromic point, it's low tide at the other. And this works east to west as well. When it's high tide at the Mull of Kintyre, it's low tide over here in Londonderry or thereabouts. The height of the tide is not related to the flow, but the flow changes with the times of the tide. So that the flow changes at the time of high tide and starts to flow in the opposite direction until low tide, and then it changes direction and flows back the opposite direction. So the flow is still there, but the height isn't. So back to our sailing directions and the Firth of Clyde. Let's look at the route around the Mull of Kintyre. So if we start looking at what the Firth of Clyde sailing directions book says, it says that heading west from Campbellton, Girvan, and the Clyde area, aim to arrive off Arranman's Barrels. I'll show you it on that chart in a moment. Arrive at Arranman's Barrels for Sander Sound, or well south of Sander if you're going on the south side of the island of Sander. Watch out for Patterson's Rock. Between high water Dover, here we're going to use the Dover time, but we've also given the equivalent for Greenock, high water Greenock. Between high water Dover and +3 on high water Dover, in other words 3 hours after Dover. So this is your best time to arrive at Arranman's Barrels if you're westbound. So you're going from the Clyde, heading for Oban, arrive between high water Dover and 3 hours later. The earlier in this window, the better, because the longer the tide runs north after rounding the Mull. And that's what you want, is you want a positive tide with you in most conditions. In ideal conditions with no westerly swell or wind against tide, it's possible to pass through the Sound of Sander up to an hour earlier than that. And we'll go into that in a few minutes. When you get past Sander, you either head well inshore for the inshore zone, I'll show you that soon, or keep at least half a mile offshore, and perhaps even more in poor conditions. And if you're using the inshore zone, pass the Mull Lighthouse, and then stand offshore a little bit, about half a mile, to keep out of some disturbed water further north. If you're heading for Rathlin Island, then keeping offshore avoids the traffic separation scheme. And so we should have a look at what that means as well. So here's a tidal chart that shows you what the flow is around the Mull of Kintyre and through Sander Island. This Arranman's Barrels that I mentioned is just about here somewhere, and this is the area that the tidal flow starts if you're coming from the east, and so you need to arrive there at that 3-hour window that we looked at. Now you can see here that there are places, like in Sound of Sander, where the tide is heading at both directions at the same time. And where these two sets of water are flowing in opposite directions, there are naturally some eddies. So you're really best to be in one or the other, not down the center between the two. So if you keep inshore, then you can follow these lines here, and you notice that at this time, 1 hour 20 before high water Greenock or high water Dover, for this time of the tidal flow, you can take the inshore route and have a positive flow around this route here, while at the same time the water is coming through the main passage between the Mull of Kintyre and Northern Ireland in the opposite direction. This chart gives us 6 of the hours, and in the Admiralty tidal chart, which is also recopied in the sailing directions, you can see a chart for every hour according to the tide. So 2 hours before high water Dover, all the tide is against us. So 2 hours is too early to get there. 1 hour before is just some slack water, and so you can take advantage of that slack water and sail around here, and there's a little bit of positive tide as long as you stay inshore. Clearly staying inshore has some danger, and then if there's an onshore wind and adverse conditions, it wouldn't be an ideal route to take. But in pleasant weather, taking the onshore route or the inshore route is very pleasant. At high water Dover, that tide starts to pick up, but you've still got some adverse tide further out. And at 1 hour after, all of the tide is heading in your direction, and that's a time which is quite a nice, safe time to go. The advantage of going 1 hour before high water Dover is that you get round the point and through the tidal gate in time, but you've still got a positive tide, a tide following you, going in your direction, in other words, giving you increased speed, perhaps for most of the way through the Sound of Jura, heading north. 2 hours after high water Dover, it's still all heading in our direction. 3 hours after, it's still heading in our direction, no problem. And so any of this time here is good for heading around the Mull of Kintyre. Today, just using March the 21st, 2020 as an example, high water Dover tides are 9:47 and 22:04. Those are the times of the high tides, UTC. Remember the warning about whether we are on BST or UTC. In March, we would be on UTC. So our window of opportunity is 9:47 until 9:47 plus 3 hours. In other words, 9:47 to 12:47 UTC. And again, of course, in the late evening from 2204 to 0147 if you'd like to go around there at midnight. When should you avoid the Mull of Kintyre as a route? Well, when there are strong winds from the south, southeast to southwest, say, and especially if there have been several days of strong wind. How strong a wind? Not that strong, actually, about force 4 or greater. If you've had force 4 or 5 or 6 for several days coming from anywhere in the south, from southeast around to southwest, then it's not a good time to be there. And the other time is if you've got strong wind against strong tide. So if you've got spring tides and a northerly wind, when you round the point, you'll find that it's very turbulent. So strong wind against strong tide is a time to avoid it. And the other time is if you've had several days of wind, strong wind stirring up the area. On the chart, we notice this purple thing, and it's labeled TSS in the North Channel. So this picture shows us, this part of the chart shows us the North Channel, that part between the Mull of Kintyre over here to the right, Mull of Kintyre, and this part of Northern Ireland and Rathlin Island here. The traffic separation scheme is a way for commercial traffic, we're talking freighters, tankers and the like, to have some chart-marked zones where they can only sail in one direction. The arrows on here show you that on the right-hand path, the northern path is between the purple separation area and the outer limit, the dotted line. So the northbound traffic would go this way and then west, and the southbound traffic comes in from the west, going eastbound and then coming around towards the south. And that's the direction they should take. But let's put some scale on here so you know how big it is. The no-go area, the purple area, is about 2 miles wide. So there's plenty of separation. This means that the northbound traffic is separated by 2 miles from the southbound traffic. And in large shipping vessels, then that's necessary to have plenty of separation. They don't have the maneuverability that we have in our yachts. They can't just go about in a boat's length. They need plenty of stopping time. So the best scheme to avoid accidents is to keep them well separated. And you'll find these traffic separation schemes all around the world in narrow places where the traffic gets confined to a narrow place like the North Channel. For us leisure boaters, the best scheme, the first choice is just to avoid the traffic separation scheme. Don't go there. This means, and you notice that it only starts at this point here and it finishes here. So if you don't go inside this box, this L-shaped box here, then you don't even have to think about what it implies. So if you're heading around the Mull of Kintyre for Rathlin Island, go around the south end here and come into here. That avoids the traffic separation scheme altogether. If you're heading north, like we've been talking about heading for Oban, then you've got a 2-mile area here, which can accommodate whatever you need to do in all circumstances. So head north and stay in this 2-mile area outside the traffic separation zone. Just as an aside, if you needed to cross across to the northern end of Rathlin Island, say, and you wanted to come around here, then you can go through the traffic separation zone, but you should go at 90 degrees to it or with it totally. You shouldn't just go at a diagonal across it. By that I mean the heading of your boat. So if you want to go from the Mull of Kintyre lighthouse here to Rathlin Island, you'll find that there's a strong tidal flow through here anyway, and so your direction of travel won't marry this, but you should aim your boat as if you were heading 90 degrees across the traffic separation scheme. Your actual, because of the tidal flow, your actual movement will be at some, so if there was a tide flowing in a northerly direction and you head at 90 degrees across here, your actual distance of travel, your actual direction of travel might be straight across here. But to get there, you probably need to head at 90 degrees to it. But that's the rules for crossing a traffic separation scheme, is to head at 90 degrees across it. The first scheme is just stay out of it if you can. Here's a picture looking at the Mull of Kintyre lighthouse from above as opposed to from the water, so this is not the view you'd normally get. but you can see that even on a nice sunny calm day, there's a certain amount of turbulence and spume and fume bubbles and stuff sitting on the surface of the water. So you can tell that this is an area where there's a certain amount of turbulence and flow. So here's our picture. We're heading from the Clyde area here. We may perhaps have stopped in Arran at Lamb Lash for an overnight stay on the way, and we head out in the morning around the island of Pladda off the south end of Arran with its lighthouse, and we head across this way. Here you can see this red mark here is labelled Arranman's Barrels, and this is the place where we should aim to arrive there at high water Dover or up to 3 hours after that point. So you look at the tide charts, say what's our window of opportunity to arrive there heading west, and if you arrive at those times, then you'll have a safe passage through here provided the weather's okay. You may possibly have come from Campbellton, and so you need to plot your course of how long will it take you to get to Arranman's Barrels. Probably 2 or 3 hours. From Campbellton, you might have stopped at the marina, say. It's a very nice place to stop, and it's a good stopping point. It's the nearest good anchorage that's very sheltered for the Mull of Kintyre passage. So you might head around there. There is another alternative, and I want to talk to you about that, of stopping at Sander Island. So sailing in here, possibly even against the adverse current, but just stopping in here and stopping at Sander Island for the day. This is Sander Island at an enlarged chart. So the Mull of Kintyre is just off here to our northwest of this chart. And here's the Admiralty chart for the whole of the Sander Island. And you can see that it gives a certain amount of detail. It shows an anchorage here in what they call Sander Roads, this area here that you could anchor in here. But it also shows it as being a bit messy. There's some drying rocks here, and there's a drying rock right in the middle. There's this Sheep Island here. Here's the Sound of Sander where the tidal flow, and you notice that it says it's 4 to 5 knots through there at either direction. This is where I want to introduce you to Antares charts. And on this particular chart that I'm showing here, this red box shows me that there's another chart available, an Antares chart in my system that I can look at. Antares Charts is run by Bob Bradfield. Here's a picture of the first of his boats, Antares, which they're named after, the top left picture, and on the bottom right, that's his current boat with his dinghy. And Bob has an unusual hobby of going around and mapping anchorages. And here's the result of this anchorage here. So here's the Admiralty chart, and you can see the level of detail we've got here. It's your depth sounder carefully, but so much better if you could look at this chart outlined in red, which looks like this. So this is the level of detail that we can get. Sorry, I've just gone too far. The level of detail that we can get from the Antares charts. So that drying rock starts to become evident. It's very steep around it, and it sits in 7 or 8 meters of water normally, but it dries out here. And the anchorage in here, and it shows 2 or 3 moorings in here. They're not visitor moorings, so don't use those. And you don't know what state they're in anyway. There's a pier over here, and there's a number of cottages and buildings over here on the island. But this is a very pleasant little anchorage and is suitably out of the tidal flow. So it's a good waiting point. If you have to wait for the window of opportunity to get round the Mull of Kintyre, this is an alternate place that you can stop, provided you like anchoring. One little point that I didn't mention, but it's worth mentioning talking about stopping at Sander, is that there is a tidal flow just north of Sander Island, in fact just north of Sheep Island, that flows, notice just here in this high water Dover, it's flowing in the opposite direction. So you've got this tidal turbulence just here. The tide always flows in that direction, or not at all. Just north of Sander, it flows from west to east. So on an ebbing or a flooding tide, it goes in the same direction the tidal flow, just for this little bit north of the island of Sander. Here's Sander Island from the air, and the anchorage, you can see one boat in the anchorage over here. That's Sheep Island, and Arran would be away over there in the distance. We can hardly see it, just sitting on the horizon. That's Arran. And here is the lighthouse on the south side of the island of Sander. It's a privately owned island, but you know that we have the right to roam in Scotland, and so you can anchor here and you might walk across here to the lighthouse to have a look, and it's a fantastic trip to make if you wanted to and you have time. This is what the lighthouse looks as you come close to it. It's a really unusual looking structure with this staircase, enclosed staircase, to get from the keeper's cottages up to the light and down again. In and around the cottages that are there, it used to be open to the public and a very nice place. There was a restaurant there, and so this was a fantastic stopping place and very popular. People would stop here and anchor between Sander and Sheep Island, and there's the Kintyre Peninsula over there, Arran away in the distance over here. You could stop here and enjoy your time. It's not so publicly open now, but you can still wander around the area. Here you can anchor here, row ashore and go for a walk across the island to the lighthouse. It's not very far. Some beautiful sunsets to be had anchored in Sander, and eventually you'll head off again and head around the Mull of Kintyre. So here's the Mull of Kintyre lighthouse sitting up there on the hill. We saw the picture looking down from a drone earlier on. This is what it looks like as you sail around there. Further north, there are other places that you can stop. You could go here. This is at Gear, the island of Gear, further up the Kintyre Peninsula. There's about 1/2 metre rise and fall of tide here. They're a little bit further away from the amphidromic point, and so there's some tidal rise and fall, but 1/2 metre is almost insignificant. There are visitor moorings. There's a pontoon that you can stop. There's a restaurant right on the beach, and there's some fantastic gardens at Ackamore House that are worth going and having a look at. So this might be one of your first stopping places on your first trip to the West Coast, and you could easily spend a couple of days here and enjoy yourself looking around the island of Gear. Here's that same bay, Ardminish Bay and Gear. Here's the pontoons. Here's the visitor moorings in this area here. Away in the distance, we can see the island of Jura, and there's the Paps of Jura sitting up on the horizon. So coming north, we would come up in this direction here, and then we would go around this mark here. There's a mark shown on the chart. Around that mark, because there's a row of rocks in here, around that mark and into the anchorage, great anchorage area, visitor moorings, pontoon, walk ashore, pub, restaurant, gardens to wander around, all sorts of things to see on the island of Gear. Alternately, you might go across to the island of Islay, and this is in Port Ellen and Islay. There's a nice area that you can stop there with some pontoons, shops, and so on, all the usual things, nice restaurants, a couple of them, and pub and so on. These are the Clyde Cruising Club's sailing directions books, and the ones that we've been talking about, looking at extracts from, are the Firth of Clyde and Kintyre to Ardnamurchan. Notice we also cover Orkney and Shetland, the Outer Hebrides or the Western Isles, and the further north on the main part of the west coast, Ardnamurchan to Cape Wrath. The Orkney and Shetland book, notice that it also covers the north and northeast of Scotland, so it covers the area from about Fraserburgh or so across into Inverness and north to Wick. So these areas are covered in the Orkney and Shetland book. This picture is taken in the Corryvreckan. We didn't talk about sailing through there, and maybe that's a topic for another day, but the Corryvreckan we would find is a place on the route and known as the Great Whirlpool. So that brings us to the end. I hope you've enjoyed that presentation of how you might plan a visit to the West Coast from the Clyde if that's where you've mostly sailed so far. Watch out for more Clyde Cruising Club webinars and presentations as they come up. Bye for now.